At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there are two specific reasons that Roman Catholics believe Ignatius is a problematic figure for Protestants. The first is his distinction between bishops and presbyters, and the second is his view of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Now, I will be dealing with that second point, the real presence of Christ, in a future video, Lord willing. But in this specific video, I want to talk a bit about the distinction between bishops and presbyters in the writings of Ignatius, and whether or not that's really a problematic point for Protestants. As a Presbyterian myself, we only recognize two offices of church government: bishop/presbyter, referring to the same office, and deacons. In high church settings, however, such as Roman Catholicism or Anglicanism, there is a three-office view, where a bishop does indeed have a different ontological office, and a superior one at that, than those that are presiding in the office of a presbyter, and deacons, of course, being the third office. Now, what seems to be the problem for Presbyterians such as myself is that when we read the writings of Ignatius, he very clearly believes in some level of distinction between a bishop and a presbyter. To Ignatius, upon reading his epistles, there does appear to be a real difference of ontological office between bishop and presbyter. And of course, that's not the view that I have as a Presbyterian. So the question must be asked, is there any way that I and many other Presbyterians, such as myself, for example, would be able to reconcile our view of church government with the view that Ignatius proposes in his letters? And I am going to argue in this video that yes, it is possible to see Ignatius in the perspective of a Presbyterian church government. I fully recognize that my Roman Catholic and Anglican viewers in particular probably won't agree with the argumentation that I'm going to lay out. But at the very least, I hope it can at least be a thought to consider in the way that we harmonize all of these ancient Christian writers with one another and their views of church government. I believe Ignatius can be harmonized with the Presbyterian church model for four reasons. The first is because it does the best job in harmonizing Ignatius with the rest of the apostolic father witness. The second is because it does the best job in harmonizing Ignatius with Jerome. The third is because it does the best job of harmonizing Irenaeus with Clement of Rome. And fourthly, because the Presbyterian model best explains some key passages from the letters of Ignatius that we were looking at here today. Much of my argumentation really isn't anything new. Many scholars have used similar arguments before. One such example that is prominent on YouTube is Dr. Gavin Ortland. But I will say that the arguments that he makes, specifically in regard to Jerome and Irenaeus, for example, he does so in the context of apostolic succession. And while I will touch on apostolic succession a bit in this argumentation, again, my primary goal is to reconcile Ignatius's view of church government with a Presbyterian view of church government. And even if I were to concede my entire argument and concede that Ignatius held to an Episcopalian structure where bishops had regional jurisdiction over the church, that still would not automatically leave you with Roman Catholicism. That would leave you with Protestant traditions like Anglicanism or some form of Lutheranism. You would have to take additional steps from there to land at the Roman Catholic position. And so the first reason why I believe this can be done is because it best reconciles Ignatius with the rest of the Apostolic Fathers. It's clear that an initial reading of Ignatius suggests that he believes in a three-office structure of the church. However, when we compare Ignatius to the rest of the writings that we have from the Apostolic Fathers time period, we discover that Ignatius is the only individual who holds to this three-office view of the church. I've already done a video on Clement of Rome, and we've examined in that video that he held to a two-office structure of church government. The same goes for Polycarp in his letter to the Philippians, and we also see this referenced in the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas. And so I think really this whole discussion boils down to this main question, and this really is the question that kind of determines where we go from here. Do we interpret Ignatius in light of the rest of the Apostolic Fathers, or do we interpret the rest of the Apostolic Fathers in light of Ignatius. My contention is that we should use the rest of the apostolic fathers to interpret Ignatius for a few reasons. The first is because Ignatius is, again, the only individual who has this distinctive three-office view. It would be one thing if Ignatius was accompanied by a few other contemporaries and they were a small minority to the rest of the apostolic father witness. But given the fact that he is the only individual from this time period that holds to the three-office view, I believe it is more reasonable to use the collective witness as a way to interpret what Ignatius is saying. And the second reason we should do this is because of the words of the New Testament itself. Again, I referenced in my video on Clement, but in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus chapter 1, we get just two examples of the Apostle Paul clearly laying out two offices of church government and recognizing bishop and presbyter as interchangeable words for the same office. When we take the two-office view of the rest of the apostolic fathers and import it into Ignatius's view of the church government, we are left with a model that resembles something like a senior pastor. We have one bishop who is selected amongst the rest of the bishops to stand out as a unifying figure, and for that reason he is given a distinctive name, bishop, from the rest of the presbyters. But ontologically speaking, he does not hold a superior office of authority to the rest of the presbyters. He shares an equal level of authority with the rest of the presbyters, but is just distinct according to function, according to name, for the sake of unity in the church. In this model, when Ignatius refers to a bishop as being distinct from a presbyter, he could very easily just be referring to that distinct function that that bishop has as a unifying figure over the rest of that church. But that does not at all necessitate the fact that that bishop has to be ontologically distinct from the office of a presbyter, nor does it suggest that that bishop has any greater level of authority over the rest of those presbyters. Consider what we would have to do if we were to flip that interpretation around and use Ignatius to interpret the rest of the apostolic fathers. If we were to take Ignatius's strict three-office view and import it into the context of Clement's two-office view, then we are left with a situation where Clement is presiding as the singular bishop in the Church of Rome, and yet the singular bishop in the Church of Rome is writing that there are only two offices in the church, and that his position as a bishop is the exact same position as the presbyters that he supposedly has authority over. I believe this attempt to reconcile Clement with Ignatius is far more difficult than simply allowing Ignatius's three-office view to be understood in light of a senior pastor Presbyterian context, where the bishop, though singled out as a unifying figure, nonetheless does not have any greater level of authority or office than the rest of the presbyters in a specific church. The second reason I am arguing this way is because I believe it does the best job harmonizing Ignatius with Jerome, who is writing about 300 years after the time of Ignatius. As is well known, in his commentary on Titus chapter 1 verse 5, Jerome states that in the early church during the first century, the office of presbyter, which is indicated by the term priest here, was the same office as a bishop, and that the churches were governed by a common council of presbyters. That was until there existed men who were slanderers and began to break apart the church and cause schisms because of their errors. When this happened, it was decreed for the whole world that one of the presbyters, priests, should be elected to preside over the others. Later on in this commentary, he doubles down on this understanding by saying that presbyters were the same as bishops, initially speaking, but gradually, as dissensions were eradicated, all solicitude was conferred on one man. Jerome's understanding of the development of the three-office view fits beautifully with the primary reason why Ignatius writes his letters in the first place. The primary reason why Ignatius writes his letters is because he is concerned about the unity of the church. He is afraid that heretics and schismatics are going to infiltrate the church, causing schisms and breaking the unity of the church. So it makes sense why Jerome states that the church started with a strict two-office view, as is found in the New Testament and Clement of Rome, among others, but that as time went on and people began to cause schisms in the church, one of those presbyters was elected above the rest to serve as a symbol of unity. In another one of his letters, in letter 146, Jerome compares this process of presbyters appointing a bishop to preside over them as soldiers appointing a general to preside over them as they head into battle. This fits well within Ignatius's understanding in a Presbyterian context, because the church started out with a two-office structure, but then as time went on and the schisms started to rise, which is why Ignatius was writing these letters in the first place, he understood that there was a process of presbyters appointing one of their own to preside as a bishop over the church. But again, that does not necessitate a higher level of authority or a different ontological office than that of a presbyter. Much like the harmonization of Ignatius with the rest of the apostolic fathers, this harmonization of Ignatius with Jerome is far better than the alternative option, in which we are left with basically saying that Jerome was just wrong in his reporting of history, that the church has always had a three-office Episcopalian structure from the time of Jesus' ascension. So when Jerome says that the church started with a strict two-office structure, he was just simply wrong. The third reason I am arguing this way is because it does the best job harmonizing Irenaeus with Clement of Rome. Irenaeus was a church father that lived during the 2nd century, and in his great work against heresies, he mentions Clement of Rome as the singular bishop in the Church of Rome during the 1st century in his line of apostolic succession. However, again, if we were to reference Clement of Rome's own letter to the Corinthians, he suggests that he believes in a two-office view of church government. If we applied the Ignatian Presbyterian model of church government to this situation with Irenaeus and Clement, we would find that the two harmonize pretty well. Irenaeus says that Clement was the singular bishop of Rome, but if bishop just simply refers to a presbyter who has a unifying function over the church, like a senior pastor, then we have no problem with Clement saying that there are a plurality of bishops in the Church of Rome, because he himself is a singular bishop in the fact that he is a unifying figure, but he doesn't hold any greater authority than the rest of the presbyters presiding in the Church of Rome. However, if we were to interpret Irenaeus' words with a strict three-office Episcopalian structure, then we would find that Irenaeus and Clement actually contradict each other, because Irenaeus is suggesting that Clement is the singular bishop of Rome, and Clement is writing in the Church of Rome in the 1st century saying that there is no singular bishop in Rome. So either Clement doesn't recognize that he himself is the singular bishop of Rome, or Irenaeus was just wrong in his reporting. Again, I believe that the Presbyterian understanding of the difference between a bishop and a presbyter fits much better in this situation with Irenaeus and Clement than a strict three-office Episcopalian approach would. And lastly, I believe this is the best way to interpret some specific passages from the Ignatian epistles. The first one of these coming from his letter to the Trallians, chapter 3, verse 1, where he states that everyone should respect the deacons as Jesus Christ, as also the bishop is an example of the Father, and the presbyters as the council of God and as the band of apostles. Now here's the important part of the quote. Without these things, a group is not recognized as a church. Now, according to Ignatius, a church must have a bishop in order to be a valid church. And Clement of Rome, again, says that there is no singular bishop in the Church of Rome during the 1st century because he understands bishop to be synonymous with presbyters, and he says that there is a plurality of presbyters appointed in the churches. And so follow the argumentation. If Ignatius says that a singular bishop is necessary for a church to be a valid church, and the Church of Rome in the 1st century doesn't have a singular bishop according to the words of Clement, then that therefore means of all churches, the church in Rome is not a valid church, unless we understand the term bishop in a Presbyterian sense, where a bishop holds the same ontological office as a presbyter, but is singled out for reasons of unity and function. And if this is the case, then there is no contradiction between Ignatius's words here in the Trallians and Clement's epistle to the Corinthians. If bishop simply applies to a unifying presbyter, then the Church of Rome does indeed have a bishop in Clement. But once again, that does not mean that Clement has any greater level of authority or office than the rest of the presbyters. This also fits well with Jerome's understanding of the development of the three-office view, and as I just explained, this fits very well with harmonizing Irenaeus with Clement in the previous point. A similar quote from Ignatius comes later on in his letter to the Trallians, chapter 7, verse 2, where he says that whoever does anything without the bishop and the council of elders and the deacons, this one does not have a clear conscience. Again, if an ontologically distinct bishop is necessary for one to have a clear conscience, and Clement indicates that the Roman Church did not have an ontologically distinct bishop, then that means no one in the Roman Church could have a clear conscience, unless the bishop is referring to a senior pastor version of a presbyter. The last quote that we'll take a look at from Ignatius is rather well known because it is often cited in regard to the topic of apostolic succession. Right now, I'm not discussing apostolic succession, but I believe the quote is still relevant when we talk about the differences between Presbyterian and Episcopalian church governments. In this quote from his letter to the Magnesians, chapter 6, Ignatius says that the bishop presides in the place of God, and the presbyters preside in the place of the council of the apostles. Notice in the bolded section that it is not the bishops who are in the place of the apostles, but the presbyters. That means if there is any apostolic succession of office going on here, that succession is being received by the presbyters, not the bishops. However, high church traditions such as Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism today both claim apostolic succession for the bishops as a distinct office from the presbyters. And if this is the case, this actually gives credence to the Presbyterian model that I'm arguing for. Because if the bishops indeed do receive genuine apostolic succession in Ignatius's understanding of that, then it suggests that bishops are in the same ontological office as presbyters. Presbyters receive apostolic succession because they're in the spot of the apostles, and bishops receive proper apostolic succession from the apostles because even though they have a different function, a different distinction of title, they are ontologically the same as a presbyter, which renders credence to the two-office view of Presbyterianism. Presbyterians would have no problem accepting the apostolic succession proper of bishops because, after all, bishops are in the same office as presbyters. They're two words for the same office. And it is the presbyters in Ignatius's view that are the ones who possess apostolic succession proper. This is why I believe it is better to harmonize Ignatius in light of a Presbyterian understanding than it is a strict Episcopalian understanding. I foresee an objection being raised in that the text says that the bishop, although they don't preside in the place of the apostles, they do preside in the place of God, which insinuates a greater authority than that of the presbyters. My response is to say that this comparison between the bishop and God could easily be made as a way to symbolize the unity of the congregation that Ignatius is so concerned about. In order to keep people from leaving the faith by following after heretics or schismatics, Ignatius could appeal them to submit to God, because without God you don't have the faith, and likewise to submit to the bishop, because if you don't submit to church authority, you are not a valid member of the church. In the senior pastor or army general model, as we articulated earlier, the bishop is designated as a presbyter who is recognized as the symbol of unity, but that does not necessitate a greater level of authority or ontological office than the rest of the presbyters. But like I said at the beginning of my argumentation, even if I were to concede all of the points that I just made, arguing for Ignatius in light of a Presbyterian model of church government, and if I were to say that Ignatius certainly held to a strict Episcopalian view of church government, that still would not automatically land you with Roman Catholicism. If anything, that would just leave you with embracing Anglicanism or some form of Lutheranism, for example. You would have additional steps to take in order to get to the Roman Catholic position. For example, you would not only have to demonstrate that there was a singular bishop in Rome in the first century, but you would also have to demonstrate that this singular bishop held infallible authority and had universal jurisdiction over the entire Christian church, neither of which are positions that are held by Anglicans today, for example. So, no, even if Ignatius held to an Episcopalian view, that does not automatically leave you with Roman Catholicism.